Reformed thinking. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to get into a really fascinating and I think a really critical period in history of the church. We're focusing on that time right after the Roman Empire became officially Christian under Constantine. We're going to track how Christ's redemptive work was carried on, but also the incredible opposition it faced right up to the point that Edwards sees as the rise of Antichrist. Our source for this is Jonathan Edwards' A History of the Work of Redemption. And what's great about Edwards is he's not just giving you a list of dates. He's analyzing it all through this lens of God's providence. He's asking, how did Christ's purposes move forward through all this chaos? So our goal here is pretty specific. We want to see the balance that Edwards presents, because he says, you can't understand God's work unless you look at both the victories and the opposition. They go hand in hand. So by looking at these two forces, you get a much clearer picture of what was really at stake. Okay, let's unpack this.
That's such a key point because Edwards' whole method is built on that idea of conflict and resolution. And this era, it's just so compelling because the whole game changes. For almost 300 years, the church was in what the Bible calls the fiery trial. It was all external. It was bloody, physical persecution from the pagan Roman state. But then Constantine comes along and, you'd think, great, peace at last. But the opposition doesn't stop.
It just changes form.
It changes form entirely. It moves from the outside, from an attack on the body to the inside. It becomes an attack on the mind, on the soul. It's an internal, intellectual, doctrinal war. And if you just look at Constantine's conversion, you might think the battle was won. But Edwards says, no, hold on. You have to measure the success against the resistance. It's the sheer scale of the counterattacks that really shows you the power of God's sovereignty in preserving the gospel. We have to see what the enemy tried to do next.
Right, let's pick up on that idea of the counterattack, because Edwards uses some really powerful apocalyptic language from the book of Revelation to talk about this. He calls it the rage of the dragon. He paints this picture of Satan, the great red dragon, being, and I'm quoting here, entirely routed and vanquished. This is after that sore conflict that lasted for nearly 3 centuries. That's the period of Roman persecution. So when the pagan state falls as an anti-Christian power, the result is dramatic. The dragon is cast down, as it were, from heaven to the earth. It's a huge political win for the church.
And that phrase, cast down from heaven to the earth, we need to be clear on what that means. It doesn't mean he's lost all his power.
Right.
Not at all. It means he lost his seat of worldly authority. He lost the ability to use the Roman government, the world's superpower, to just openly try and kill the church. He was defeated in that specific strategy. But as Edwards notes, the serpent is still in a rage, and he immediately starts using new devices against the church.
And these new devices are much more subtle.
Exactly. The whole war shifts from open battle to deception. It's a change from trying to kill Christians to trying to corrupt Christianity itself. The goal isn't to empty the churches through martyrdom, but to hollow out their doctrine from the inside.
And that's where that image from Revelation 12 comes in. The serpent, now that he's been thrown down, he casts out of his mouth water as a flood to cause the woman to be carried away of the flood.
Mm-hmm.
This image of a flood, a destructive spiritual flood.
Mm-hmm.
That's the central metaphor for all the opposition during this period. It's not the fire of Nero anymore. It's a torrent of confusion and bad theology.
And that flood, as Edwards lays it out, it really has 2 main currents. We can basically break down all the opposition between Constantine and the rise of Antichrist into these 2 streams. The first, and honestly the most dangerous, was this internal corruption of the church through heresies. This was an attempt to change the very thing Christians worship. And the second stream was a renewed effort to just restore paganism, to bring the old gods back.
And it's so important to remember how short that period of peace really was. Can you imagine the relief after centuries of persecution when Constantine wins? And yet, Edwards says that peace was but very short.
He calls it a respite. He says it was like a silence in heaven for, as it were, for half an hour. And he connects that right back to Revelation, where the angels hold back the winds of destruction, but only for a moment, just long enough so that the servants of God should be sealed in their foreheads. It suggests the peace was a divine gift, but for preparation, not for rest.
Time to get ready for the next battle.
Exactly. And that battle came fast. The quiet time passed, and the visible church soon became, as Edwards puts it, greatly infested with heresies.
Okay, let's get into that first part of the flood then.
Yeah.
The internal strife. This is where the church, right after its biggest political victory, faces what could have been a total theological collapse.
Mm.
And Edwards points to 2 major movements, Arianism and Pelagianism. Let's start with Arianism because it pops up almost immediately after Constantine is in power. And this wasn't some small disagreement. This was an attack on the very person of Jesus Christ. The Arians denied the Trinity. They said that Christ and the Holy Spirit were not fully God, that they were but mere creatures.
And we have to stop there for a second, because from a Reformed viewpoint, this is just catastrophic. If Christ is a creature, no matter how high or glorious a creature, if there was a time when he did not exist, as Arius taught, well, then redemption is impossible. Only an infinite God can absorb the infinite wrath of God that's due for sin. A creature can't save other creatures. So this heresy wasn't a side issue. It struck at the absolute heart of the gospel. And Edwards points out how this thing just exploded. He says it threatened to overthrow all. This was a battle for the very identity of the Christian God. You had men like Athanasius standing up against it, saying, no, Christ is homoousios, of the very same substance as the Father. You know, his famous stance, Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world. That really gives you a sense of the scale of this.
And the scale is just, it's hard to get your head around. Edwards says that before the end of the 4th century, the greater part of the Christian church will become Arians. Now, that's a point we have to wrestle with. If Edwards is saying the majority of the visible church went over to this heresy, how does that fit with the idea of Christ's kingdom being successful? Where was the true church?
And that's the paradox, isn't it? Edwards' whole history works on these two levels. You have the visible institutional church, and then you have the invisible work of redemption being carried on in the hearts of the elect. So yes, Arianism took over. It captured bishops, councils, even some of the emperors.
A high ground.
It captured all the high ground. But the work of redemption, the truth of the gospel itself, it survived. It survived in people like Athanasius and his followers who would not bend. So the woman, the true church, was threatened by the flood, but she wasn't carried away. And the threat became intensely political because, as the source says, some of the emperors who came after Constantine were Arians themselves. So they became the prevailing party, and they used their civil power, the very power the church had welcomed, to start a huge persecution against the Orthodox believers.
So the persecution actually never stopped. It just changed sides. Instead of pagan Rome coming after you, now you had an Arian emperor using Christian language to enforce a heresy. This is exactly why Edwards calls Arianism the flood out of the mouth of the serpent. It was this theological wave, but it had the full force of the government behind it.
The irony is just staggering. The church wanted peace from the state, but what it got was the state being co-opted by heresy. And when the emperor himself is a heretic, the government becomes an enemy of the truth. You could argue that's way more dangerous than pagan persecution.
How so?
Well, with pagan persecution, the battle lines are clear. But with state-backed heresy, everything gets confused. It divides the church from within. It makes it almost impossible for the average person to know who to believe.
It's a classic example of the enemy changing tactics. If you can't kill the church with swords, you try to poison it from the inside with bad ideas. Okay, so that's Arianism. Let's turn to the second major internal heresy in this flood, Pelagianism. This one comes up at the start of the next century from a British monk named Pelagius, or Morgan. And if Arianism attacked the person of Christ, Pelagianism really attacked the work of the Holy Spirit.
That's a great way to put it. The focus shifts from Christology to anthropology, the doctrine of man. Pelagianism started by denying original sin. It denied the idea that we inherit Adam's guilt and corrupt nature, which leaves us spiritually dead and unable to choose God. And if you deny that, you then have to deny the influence of the Spirit of God in conversion. Instead, you start talking about the power of the will. Basically, Pelagianism teaches that man, on his own, has the natural ability to choose God and achieve his own salvation.
And for anyone coming at this from the perspective of the Westminster Confession, this is just a complete rejection of sovereign grace. If man isn't dead in sin, but just, wounded or sick, then salvation isn't a resurrection, it's a partnership. And God's grace isn't necessary, it's just helpful.
That's right. It puts some of the glory for salvation back onto the sinner. And Edwards saw this as a very specific spiritual attack. You see the pattern. Arianism says the Savior isn't really God, so he's not enough to save you. And Pelagianism says the sinner isn't really dead, so he doesn't need that much saving.
Both roads lead to the same place.
They both dethrone the God who saves all by himself, by his grace alone. And the great defender against Pelagianism was, of course, St. Augustine. Edwards points to him as the main opponent, the one who wrote so powerfully in defense of Orthodox faith. Augustine's whole argument was built on the absolute necessity of grace.
So to sum up that internal threat for you, Arianism tries to destroy redemption by making Christ a mere creature. Pelagianism tries to destroy by saying man doesn't really need that kind of radical redemption in the first place. So that's the internal attack, a flood of confusion. But the dragon wasn't just working from the inside. Let's move to part 3, because the opposition shifts back to external threats. The goal now is to just bring back old-fashioned paganism.
It's a two-pronged attack, isn't it? If you can't corrupt the church, try to kill it again. And the first major attempt to do that politically came from Julian the Apostate. Julian was Constantine's nephew. He was raised as a Christian, but he rejected the faith, he apostatized, and when he became emperor, he was a committed pagan. His story shows that the dragon's influence could reach right into the heart of the new Christian empire.
And Julian was smart. He knew that just rounding up Christians and throwing them to the lions again wasn't going to work. It hadn't worked before. So he used a more strategic approach. He used the power of the state to undermine the church. Can you walk us through some of his methods? Because it was a really sophisticated campaign.
It was. He knew the church's power was now tied to its role in society and government. So Edwards mentions 3 main strategies. First, he kicked Christians out of positions of power. He replaced Christian magistrates with pagans. This basically cuts Christians off from civil authority and makes life very difficult for them legally. Second, he rebuilt all the old heathen temples and put government money back into pagan worship. He gave paganism an official public platform again.
And the third one was about education, right?
That's right. This was maybe his most clever move. He banned Christians from teaching classical literature and rhetoric. His argument was, you Christians say our gods are demons, so you shouldn't be allowed to teach the great literature that honors them. It was a direct attempt to make the next generation of Christian leaders uneducated and unfit for public life.
So while Edwards calls him a most notorious persecutor, it was more of a death by 1,000 cuts kind of persecution.
In many ways, yes, though there were still martyrs under Julian, but his main goal was to kill the influence of Christianity, to make it culturally irrelevant. And he had this famous contempt for Christ. He never called him Christ. He always called him the Galilean, as a way to belittle him.
But the story of Julian's death is one of the most powerful moments in Edwards' narrative. It's this incredible example of God's providence just shutting the whole project down. He's on campaign against the Persians, and he gets hit with a lance. And the story goes that as he's dying, he takes a handful of his own blood, throws it up into the air, and shouts, "Thou hast overcome, O Galilean."
It's such a powerful moment. It's this involuntary confession of total defeat from the man who tried to turn back the clock. It's an admission that the work of Christ is unstoppable, even by the Roman emperor himself. And of course, Julian's anti-Christian policies died with him. So Julian's failure proved that you couldn't just use politics to restore paganism from the top down. But the dragon had another plan, a much more chaotic, brute force plan, the barbarian invasions.
And this brings us to that second great external threat, the massive movements of the Goths, the Vandals, all these barbarous nations from the north, as Edwards calls them. These were mostly pagan or Arian tribes that just came pouring into the Roman world, and they completely shattered the political stability of the West. They overran the empire, they sacked Rome itself in the 5th century, and they basically carved up the whole western half of the empire for themselves. And for Edwards, this isn't just a political event, it's a prophetic one.
That connection to prophecy is absolutely key to how Edwards sees history. For him, history is just the Bible being unfolded in time. So he looks at this event, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, and he sees it being divided into exactly 10 kingdoms. And he identifies this as the beginning of the 10 horns of the beast from Daniel and Revelation. Those 10 horns, in this Protestant interpretation that Edwards is working with, are the 10 kings who should rise in the latter part of the Roman Empire. They're the new nations that are built on the ruins of old Rome. The Franks, the Saxons, the Goths, and so on.
And he connects this to Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel 2 as well, right? The great statue with the head of gold, and then silver, bronze, iron, and then the feet and toes of mixed iron and clay.
Exactly. Those 10 toes represent these 10 fragmented kingdoms. They're the final form of Gentile world power before Christ returns to smash the whole statue. So what looks like just a military collapse is, for Edwards, a very precise fulfillment of prophecy. And he also connects these invasions to the sounding of the 4 first trumpets in Revelation 8. The first trumpet is the Goths under Alaric. The second is the Vandals. The third is Attila the Hun. And the fourth is the final end of the Western Roman Emperor. So these aren't random events. They're divinely controlled judgments, moving history toward God's ultimate end.
So you have this massive two-front war against the church. Internally, you have Arianism and Pelagianism. Externally, you have Julian and then the Goths. It was designed to either corrupt the church from within or just tear it apart from without, and yet the main point of Edward's story is that it all failed. So this brings us to part 4, the triumph of the gospel. In spite of everything, the dragon could not obtain his design. The floods did not sweep the woman away.
And the first sign of that success is that the heresies were defeated. Edward says they dwindled away and orthodoxy was again restored. The Nicene faith in the full divinity of Christ eventually won out over Arianism, and the Augustinian view of grace defeated Pelagianism. It wasn't easy, and it took centuries, but the truth was preserved. And Edwards describes this victory using that amazing image from Revelation 12 again. The earth helped the woman and opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth.
Let's talk about that image. The earth helped the woman. What does the earth represent here? Seems to be God using natural or historical events, secondary causes, to protect the church.
That's how Edward sees it. The earth can be secular powers or historical events that, without intending to, end up helping the true church. For example, many of those barbarian tribes that invaded, the Goths and the Franks, they eventually converted to Orthodox Nicene Christianity. So their new political kingdoms, the earth, ended up absorbing the flood of Arianism and became the new ground where the gospel could grow. God uses the chaos to achieve his own ends. And this wasn't just about survival, it was also about expansion. The success was twofold. You have the survival of the truth in the old Roman lands, but at the same time, you have this quiet, steady expansion of the gospel into new territories, completely outside the old empire.
Right, let's focus on that expansion for a minute, because it's such a paradox. While the big institutional church is fighting these huge doctrinal wars, the kingdom of Christ is just quietly advancing somewhere else. The source mentions that even back in Constantine's time, there was considerable propagation of the gospel in the East Indies. This is far beyond the reach of Rome, and it was mostly thanks to the work of one man, Frumentius.
The story of Frumentius is incredible. He was shipwrecked or captured as a boy, taken to what we'd now call Ethiopia, and he eventually rose to a high position in the royal court there.
And he used that position to spread the faith.
He did. He got permission for churches to be built, and later he traveled to Alexandria, where he was ordained as a bishop by Athanasius himself, the great champion of orthodoxy, and then he went back to establish the church in Ethiopia. So at the same time, Athanasius is fighting for the life of the gospel in the Mediterranean. He's also overseeing its expansion to the edges of the known world. And there's an equally powerful story about the conversion of the Liberians. Edward says that great numbers of them were converted by a Christian woman of eminent piety whom they had taken captive.
And that one little detail says so much. The gospel doesn't just spread through emperors and councils. Sometimes it spreads through the faithful witness of a single, anonymous captive woman whose life was so compelling that she converted her captors. Edwards puts that in there for a reason. He wants to show you that God's work is not dependent on our grand strategies or our political power.
And he confirms this was a pattern. He says several other barbarous nations received the gospel in the same way. Through the teaching and example of Christian captives, the word of God is not chained, even when his people are. Then, as you move into the later 4th century, around 372 AD, the gospel spreads among the people of Arabia, so it's pushing south and east.
And it's also spreading among the northern nations, the very people who were invading the empire. We're told that a prince of the Goths and many of his people became Christians. This is just amazing. The very people who are acting as God's judgment on the Roman Empire are, at the same time, being brought into the kingdom of redemption.
It shows you the complexity of God's providence. Then, at the end of that century, the gospel spreads further among the Persians, Rome's great rival, and also among the Scythians. And the Scythians are important because Paul mentions them in Colossians 3, barbarian, Scythian, bond nor free. They represent the ends of the earth, the people beyond the borders of civilization. The gospel reaching them proves that Christ's kingdom is for everyone.
And this continues right into the 5th century. Around 430 AD, you get a remarkable conversion of the Burgundians, another of the big Germanic tribes that settled in what is now France. And then closer to home for Edward's original audience, the gospel really starts to take root in Ireland. The people there who had been heathen until this point begin to receive the faith. And it also spreads further in Scotland. So the gospel is building this new stronghold in the British Isles, even as Roman power there completely disappears.
And just to round out the list, Edwards notes that in the 6th century, a king named Zaphis, who ruled the Colchians near the Black Sea, converted from paganism to Christianity. along with many of his people. So when you step back and look at the whole picture, you see this incredible sovereign plan. On the one hand, you have the visible church almost being destroyed by the floods of Arianism and Pelagianism and the external attacks from Julian and the Goths. But at the exact same time, the work of redemption is quietly, relentlessly expanding into new territory through the most humble and unexpected means.
It's the ultimate paradox. While the great theologians in Rome and Constantinople are debating whether Christ is a creature, the message of that same Christ is conquering the hearts of kings and captives 1,000 miles away. The real growth was happening on the margins. So we have completed our deep dive into this incredibly volatile era, from Constantine's conversion right up to the doorstep of the Middle Ages. We saw the serpent's two-pronged attack, the internal flood of heresy with Arianism and Pelagianism, and the external flood of violence and political upheaval from Julian and the invading Goths. And yet, through it all, we saw the unstoppable expansion of Christ's kingdom, reaching into the East Indies and Ireland, among the Scythians and Burgundians. It shows that the work of redemption is not tied to the fate of any single empire or institution.
Edward's whole point in structuring his history this way is to show you God's complete control over both the success and the opposition. The dragon unleashes a flood, but the earth swallows it. Heresies rise up, but God raises up men like Athanasius and Augustine to defend the truth. Empires fall, but the gospel just keeps spreading. And I think the lesson here for you, the listener, is that the real lasting growth of the church doesn't always happen in times of peace and security. It often happens when the church is under the most pressure, when believers are forced to rely on nothing but the simple power of the gospel itself. And that leaves us with a pretty challenging thought. If Edwards shows us that the greatest threats to the church in that era came from doctrinal confusion, from these subtle errors that attack the person of Christ and the grace of God, well, it raises a question for us, doesn't it? What theological truths might we be taking for granted or allowing to be watered down today that could be preparing the ground for the next flood of opposition against the purity of the gospel? Something for you to think about.